Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this FSDC webinar for launching the paper on navigating the evolving sustainable landscape, Hong Kong's crucial role in financing the transition to sustainability. This is actually the seventh paper focusing on ESG and green finance related topics that FSDC has released since the inaugural paper published in 2016. While Hong Kong has made significant progress in developing green and sustainable finance in recent years, transition finance has emerged as a key driver in the global efforts to mitigate climate change. At COP29 in Baku earlier this month, transition finance was elevated on the global agenda, with nations collaborating to establish a new quantifiable climate finance goals for post-2025 actions for developing countries. I'm pleased to report that FSDC was privileged to host a joint panel discussion with the Friends of the Earth Hong Kong on transition finance at the China Pavilion on day one of COP29. Well, in light of this global trend, the FSDC formed a dedicated working group of industry experts to put together the paper which we are publishing today, with recommendations aiming to develop Hong Kong into a regional transition finance hub. On this note, I'm delighted to have our two working group co-leaders, Gabriel Wilson Otto at Fidelity International and Ms. YK Park from APG Asset Management, together with two other working group members, Ellie Tang at Urban Land Institute and Ronald Wu from UBS as our panelists. Before I invite Gabriel to give a brief highlight of the paper's recommendations, I would like to thank all the working group members for their valuable contribution to this insightful paper. Over to you, Gabriel.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm really excited to be sharing this today because what I really see the paper is doing is helping chart the next chapter in Hong Kong's development as a sustainable finance hub. So to date, there's been some fantastic work that has been done, which has effectively been building up capability on sustainability, on ESG, from both the data perspective, as well as tools, training and education, financing and support. What we're really trying to look at in this paper is how do we take that to the next level in terms of focusing on collaboration and transition finance to build on that foundation and to really deliver on the ambition of becoming a transition finance hub, as this is one of the most important areas of sustainable finance development over the next 10 or 20 years. So first, what is transition finance? What does it mean when we're talking about transition finance, and why are we focusing on it? So first, the distinction between green and transition is that something that is classified as green is already at a very high level of sustainability. It's about the current positioning and characteristics of the activity. Transition finance is a little bit different because it's more about improvement from a base and system-wide transition. So for climate change, this could be activities that are green and contribute towards decarbonisation, such as solar farms, but it can also be about activities for decarbonisation, such as the early retirement of a coal asset, or even lowering the carbon emissions from a heavily carbon-intensive industrial process. So the advantages of this, as we can see on the top right, is that it covers a much broader range of activities and is actually better aligned to marrying continued economic growth along with positive and meaningful climate impacts. What we can also see on the bottom right of this chart is that there is a huge funding gap globally. So this is more than $4 trillion annually, and this is just representing the size of the potential investment opportunity set. On the next slide, what we highlight is that this is really a great opportunity for Hong Kong to build on its current position as a green finance hub. And also that transition is even more important for Asia than other parts of the world. So if we look at the financing need in Asia, we're talking of billions of dollars annually, hundreds of billions of dollars that need to go into this in order to facilitate the transition. Also, Asia has the complexity of having a younger fleet of power generation assets and fossil fuel generation assets relative to Europe or the US. So what this highlights is that it's not about retirement, it's not about going straight to green, It's about how do we get there on a pathway that involves balancing economic growth in the region and continued prosperity with achieving decarbonisation and our objectives. And so we need a transition pathway in order to get there. And so this is really what the paper is trying to focus on and build out. Hong Kong is very well positioned to drive this, both from the excellent work that's been done to date in terms of capability building, coordination, and structuring that has happened within Hong Kong. And we can see this reflected within over 18 billion of green, sustainable and sustainable linked instruments that were issued in 2023. So again, just highlighting that volume of support that's come through from financial markets, but also the critical role that the government's played in enabling this through favourable policies, supporting capability building, subsidising green loans and green bonds, and a range of other activities that have helped support growth. So what we're looking at as we move to the recommendations within the paper is really 4 recommendations. The first is more of a high-level overarching comment and statement around what are the building blocks and requirements that we need to transition and to build that capability, with the other 3 being more specific, actionable with regards to the activities that we believe could help support this transition. So first, the 3-pillar approach, what is it? What are we talking about with recommendation 1? This is really, when we look at the challenges for transition finance, what we commonly hear amongst our clients globally and amongst financial investment communities is that policy certainty, a lack of taxonomy and harmonisation, and also a lack of collaboration in industry standards and acceptance of approaches can be some key barriers to transition finance scaling. And so what we're highlighting here is really trying to draw attention to those areas and highlight that increased policy certainty combined with support for novel structuring frameworks and partnership and collaboration can be a really powerful catalyst. So the first recommendation is about how we can work together to drive those elements, as well as encouraging interoperability between different standards that exist within the market, and also looking at the potential for coordination not only between industry and government within Hong Kong, the Greater Bay Area and mainland China, but also with other economies within Asia that are looking at decarbonisation, such as the partnerships between HKMA and entities within the Middle East. It's a fantastic example of how we can use our expertise to catalyse connectivity and business growth across the region. If we look at recommendation 2, what we're trying to achieve here is looking at building on what my prior comments. What are some of the more explicit areas of capability building and gaps that we see within the market, and what are some of the hardest things to overcome? So again, one of the key challenges is the risk-return balance for decarbonising some activities. And this is where novel structures such as blended finance can help increase the scope of potential decarbonisation projects that can be banked. This is also really important for building capability and capacity within the industry to understand what a transition pathway is and then how to actually invest on that basis, hitting both an economic objective as well as maintaining social safeguards and economic growth. So for us, this is a really important area where the partnership between government, industry and multinational development banks can really help catalyse growth that we're really excited about. If we move to recommendation 3, this is again building on the concept of collaboration and dialogue to help drive change and is related to recommendation 4. So first, collaboration between government, different stakeholders and industry, and this can be NGOs, civil society, or a broad range of stakeholders, can be critical for helping to actually set and guide a practical pathway that's implementable and to help identify where specific blockages could be within sectors. So, for example, is it a lack of technology? Is it a price problem? Is it a problem of capability and scale or maturity of development of solutions? Identifying some of these bridging and gapping points can help us create bridges as an industry in order to help meet a lot of different financing needs. So again, working as an industry to deliver on the government's objective of decarbonisation is a critical component and enabler. And this is tied to recommendation 4, which is effectively looking at how we can deliver more specific and actionable activities to effectively itemize at a more granular level the pathway to achieving the decarbonisation objective that Hong Kong has established. This is critical because it goes back to the first point around policy certainty in terms of providing those long-term signals to industry with regards to how capital can be deployed in order to achieve these goals. So from my perspective, that level of innovation in product, as well as data, as well as industry collaboration, help put the clarity towards the overarching decarbonisation target and drive real action. So they're the four main recommendations. And if I summarize them in a very short one line, it's effectively shifting from capability building to collaboration and solutions. And I think that that's a really important ambition for the next step of Hong Kong's development and evolution as a sustainable finance hub.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriel, for that concise summary. Maybe I'll start the panel discussion with YK first. For the adoption of transition finance, we know that it varies across regions and jurisdictions. So how widely do you think this financial tool is being adopted globally, especially in APAC? And also, well, of course, we hope transition finance will hopefully become as prominent as green finance, right, among asset owners in APAC and Hong Kong. And if the answer is yes, then what are the opportunities for Hong Kong?
Thanks, King. You raised few questions, but then I think you already know the answer. And we already know the answer. So that whenever I deal with, let's say, government pension funds or pension funds, government sovereign funds in around Asia Pacific, and including different ministries of different governments, there is no government and pension funds or government funds. They don't look at this transition fund or transition finance or energy transition finance, etc., so that they all look at this and that they all think about, they all talk about it. So that your question about how much adoption has been done, it's been adopted, and then they're all good students of those tools and toolbooks and etc. I think Hong Kong this is going to be a great opportunity for Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong's asset owners society. And I'm sure that there are a lot of discussions happening, and including that HKMA is heavily discussing about energy transition financing opportunities. And then they actually launched very early stage of launching some of it. And even Hong Kong government, there's a cross-agency steering group, so that they are thinking about the tools and projects and how to help Hong Kong financial community, etc. So that is happening. Is it going to be a prominent one? Definitely. I'm sure that as we are moving toward 2030, and we are climate change, we are facing 1.17 degrees. We were hoping to get 1.5 degrees. Today, we are already approaching 1.17. So that it is not 2050 problem. It's not even 2030 problem. This is today's problem. So I think everybody's talking about it. So that's happening. But it is the issue with the transition is we are not just talking about financing tools and transitioning. We should think about, let's say, societal changes and people's mindset. We should continue to have a growth mindset, but at the same time, change and transition mindset. So that I think talking about just transition financing is wrong. We need to think about the project, not just mega project. We need to think about small project, a symbolic project that can change the Hong Kong society and Hong Kong industries and Hong Kong companies, etc. Yeah. But if anyone is looking for something basic, I mean, OECD, there's a transition financing book there. It's very long, but then it's quite useful. If you go to any of the Hong Kong, let's say, financing institutions website. There is something around there, so that there are plenty of let's say tools, resources available.
I'm glad I can highlight what Hong Kong has done so far, and we have actually put out a lot of initiatives. But Gabriel, so what do you think? How Hong Kong compares to other international financial centers in the readiness of supporting transition finance, and most importantly, of the recommendations that you just highlighted from our report? Which one do you believe will have the most immediate impact in channeling international capital into Hong Kong's transition finance landscape?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think that there's really two elements to how Hong Kong has been evolving as a sustainable finance hub. I think that definitely, if we're looking at some of the data that I just mentioned around issuance volume, around capability building, there's a fantastic foundation that we can then leverage on. Some of the other areas, so that's one area, which is capability, more of the technical ecosystem required for transition finance. It's here, it's been built. The question is, how does that then get translated into new evolving areas of transition finance through frameworks, partnerships, and other areas? The second component, moving on from the foundational capability side, is really looking more at the opportunity. And Hong Kong is really uniquely placed in terms of being able to facilitate capital flows into mainland China and to help facilitate decarbonisation. And a really exciting development over the last few years has been the provincial level decarbonisation strategies that have been adopted within the mainland. And we're seeing development of a national decarbonisation and transition framework covering 4 sectors, which will be rolled out at some stage in the next 12 months, hopefully. So what that's effectively highlighting is that transition finance is a growing theme everywhere in Asia. Hong Kong is uniquely positioned to help internationalise China's developments for transition finance with the mainland transition taxonomy and transition activities. And for me, that's a really exciting position for Hong Kong to be in terms of both the foundation, but then also the privileged position of being able to facilitate capital flows and decarbonise mainland. The other element of the question is okay, so that's the positioning. What are we most excited about? What am I most excited about? If I could cheat, I would pick 2. So one would be international financing, recommendation 2 on scaling finance through blended finance and innovative structures. Those sorts of partnerships can immediately result in a step change in the volume of transition finance and also the number of participants. By having a standardized framework, that really provides a blueprint for others within this industry to follow and lowers due diligence, transaction costs, and can really help facilitate capital flows. So to answer directly, recommendation 2 is the one I would be most excited about. In terms of local action and decarbonisation within Hong Kong and catalysing local development within local industry, recommendation 4 is probably the one that I would point towards, with more concrete pathways and policy certainty providing that roadmap for future action for local industry to follow.
Oh, thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, we will come back to the blend finance later. It's quite an interesting concept. But you highlighted the importance of Hong Kong supporting the decarbonisation efforts on the mainland. Perhaps I could turn to Ronald, because this is a topic I believe you are experts in. Can you share your views with us on that?
Sure. So I think Gabriel already pointed to many of the exciting things that are happening. But I think what's really encouraging about the development in China today is that we actually see very concrete plans, targets, and initiatives to decarbonize some of the hard to abate sectors. So just in 2024 alone, we already have targets to reduce energy intensity by 2.5%. CO2 or carbon intensity by 3.9%. And for the industrial sectors, energy efficiency or energy intensity would improve by 3.5%. So these are not easy targets to achieve, but it shows the ambition and also reinforce the idea that China is very much keen to develop or reduce its carbon, not just through the power sector, but all in these hard industrial sectors as well. As Gabriel mentioned, we're expecting 4 sectors that will take a lead and with more concrete actions and plans. So you're looking at cement, refining, and the ammonia, and last one is 4 of them. Sorry, it just slipped me. But I think that the key point is that when you look at these sectors, these are some of the sectors that contribute hugely to China's CO2, and therefore it's really vital for them to find a solution and to decarbonize. Now, I think what's exciting about China's effort today is that they're not limited to just these 4 sectors, but we're actually also seeing activities and opportunities, in fact, in other sectors and segments as well. So many of you may have heard of the new for old scheme. Obviously, that applies to appliances, to autos, but one huge component of it is on equipment. A lot of those equipment would be used in industries. And I think the really exciting thing about it is that it brings both environmental benefits, but also it's meant to be an economic multiplier for the economy. So that's something that we see as a huge policy initiative from now to at least 2027. So I think that would provide a lot of support in terms of CapEx, in terms of just accelerating the cycle of changes in many of these companies. And the last thing that last 2 examples I'll point to is that we're looking at changes in the transport sector as well. So, for example, many of you know that the IMO will be enforcing or imposing a carbon reduction target. China will be a huge beneficiary all along the supply chain, but one of the key beneficiaries would be the shipyards. For some of the Chinese ship makers, already 30% of their order books is for dual fuel ships. So these are boats or vessels that can have the potential to be run on much cleaner fuel. And I think that's one example of how China can really help accelerate the process. And then on your second part of the question, King, I think my cheeky answer would be whatever Gabriel said, and also whatever is in the report. But I'll just add a quick point, which is that I think if you look at China's capital market, it has this unique convergence of many of these listed companies listed in Hong Kong. So that's something that you do not see in many other markets. On the other side of the coin, you also see a very high concentration of sophisticated and really professional sustainability or transition expert or asset managers who really care about it in Hong Kong as well. So what that means is that there could be meaningful engagements and really co-learning between the 2 sides. So I think that's one thing that really separates Hong Kong from most of the markets we see around the world.
Oh, thank you. Ronald, actually, you just brought up a very important point. Thanks again for sharing what mainland China has done on this transition plan. But I need to ask Ellie, because Ronald just said, it's important to bring investors and issuers together in a way, right? Because you need to raise capital to finance these transitions. So, what do you think are the common considerations when the investors try to incorporate transition finance in their investment strategies, and also how can we better engage them, in making this jump into transition finance, considering that some of the returns may not be as attractive as conventional tools.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think before we talk about how to make transition finance important, first of all, we need to make sure the transition planning is done properly on an issuer level. So from a company's perspective, I think just common sense, right? When you start, you need to think about whether this transition towards net zero would cause any potential disruption to your business model. So that goes to considerations such as how fast you need to transition, what are the essential elements to be included, any initiatives to prioritize, or any part of your business model that requires changing. And thankfully, there are increasing requirements and frameworks to help issuers brainstorm the correct elements to be included in transition plan, including disclosure requirements and other transition taxonomies. But speaking from, say, the real estate sector or built environment sector, there could be sectoral pathways as well and specific guidance on top of general sustainability and transition requirements for a company to consider when they're doing their transition planning. And last but not least, I think it's important to think more broadly, as a lot of speakers early on touch on systemic risks and the issue of just transition. So that it's quite clear that transition is not just about decarbonization or improving your environmental performance from a company's perspective. It's very much about thinking long-term interest regarding your stakeholders, including your employees or your wider customer base, your supply chain, your regulators. So I would say transition planning has to do with thinking about a company's reputation as well. But I guess from a company's perspective, it's not all about risk management when we are thinking about transition. There will be a lot of different benefits and opportunities to a business as well. So these include, an earlier planning and more credible disclosure of transition would help a company broaden their investor base and help investors understand they are proactively thinking long-term and sort of future-proofing their business, if you will. And this would potentially reduce the cost of lending if a company has a more robust sustainability program in place. And of course, it would enhance company reputation as well. And for the hard to abate sectors, we heard briefly earlier about different technologies in place. So transitioning is also a great opportunity for a company to innovate through technology adoption. So that's kind of the transition planning common considerations for an issuer level in a nutshell. So when it comes to investors, naturally would think about the portfolio risks. And investors typically invest in different sectors, different companies, spread across various markets. And the interesting thing and the tricky point here is that not every single jurisdiction is on the same page when it comes to transitioning towards net zero. So the recommendation in our report, which touches on the importance of interoperability of policies, of taxonomies, becomes super important here. So in the past couple of years, when it comes to climate, I think a lot of us are quite familiar with TCFD's guidance when it comes to climate disclosure and its recommended framework of considering governance, metrics and targets, risk management. So all of those are super important. But on top of that, in the recent years, we're seeing more specific guidance, frameworks for transition, such as the UK's Transition Plan Task Force framework, which calls for the key principles of ambition, action, and accountability in sector agnostic transition plans. But in addition, the TPT also issued sector-specific guidance covering, financial institutions or high-emitting sectors like industrial, real estate, and so forth. So, these are very useful tools for investors to take reference of when they're working on their transition plan, which inevitably involves understanding whether their investee companies' transition plans are robust and credible. But as an investor, I think there are more concerns. So because we typically invest in cross-sector opportunities, so we need to think about systemic risks. So organizations like GFANZ, which has brought together different parts of the finance industry, the whole ecosystem, has issued an important guidance on financial institution net zero plans with specific building blocks. So this is a very handy reference for investors and other financial institutions to look at when we're considering how to credibly transition our investment opportunities. And coming back to Hong Kong, or just Asia in general, we're seeing, more emergence of taxonomy, such as, the HKMA's issuance of Hong Kong taxonomy, which will include more elements of transition. And in Singapore, we also see that the Singapore Asia taxonomy has included transition already. So all of these will definitely facilitate more financing towards transition opportunities. And I think the last thing I would say here, and it's an interesting point to note, isn't that transition finance is not profitable per se. It's just that previously there was a lack of standardization and framework to help different stakeholders to think about, cross-sector issues and challenges when it comes to transition. So as these standards and requirements or frameworks are in place, we do expect to see transition planning becoming more of a norm on an issuer level, and investors will take more of an interest in transition finance.
Oh, thank you so much, Ali, for bringing out the incentive for companies who focus on transition finance, such as reputation and incentive to innovate, technology adoption. That we also highlighted the importance of interoperability. So, Gabriel, I think you also mentioned in your presentation earlier. So, on this very important point, so what steps do you think Hong Kong can take to facilitate greater alignment and interoperability between local and global frameworks to ensure that there is a seamless cross-border, cross-boundary investments in transition finance?
So I think that there's, again, two elements to this. The one is for an issuer and the other one is for an investor. So from an issuer's mindset, the key element is understanding what they need to do in order to have an instrument or activity classified as being a transition activity. And given the different frameworks that exist in different parts of the world, that's not one definition. So having a clear idea of where there's overlap, such as the Common Ground taxonomy, is a fantastic way of being able to use a guidebook to say, are there small changes that I need to make to an activity in terms of disclosure for a transaction in order for it to be eligible in multiple jurisdictions as a transition instrument? So from an issuer perspective, understanding that overlap and a common ground taxonomy and framework is really critical and can really help facilitate capital flow. This is particularly important for international issuers, which might have banking syndicates or other partners in different parts of the world that are actually held to different standards on sustainability or transition. So understanding that overlap can really lower transaction costs and facilitate alignment very quickly. From an investor's standpoint, that understanding the frameworks and overlap is an important component. The other element is around the specific metrics that are disclosed in order to facilitate classification of that instrument. So typically for a player like us, and the other institutional managers, is when we're looking at an instrument, we're trying to match it with individual funds that are linked to specific sustainability outcomes and client preferences. So the more information we have about the instrument and understanding how it's classified, but also the metrics to demonstrate the positive real-world impact as a result of that transition, it really makes that alignment a lot easier. So again, looking at not only the overlap and understanding the common ground taxonomy or extension into transition finance, it's also looking at the underlying metrics to facilitate classification, reporting, demonstrate real-world impact, and really align with client preferences and fund structures.
That's very important. You highlighted the importance of common ground taxonomy and how it can be implemented. So that brings our discussion back to blend finance, because this is a concept that we want to explore a bit more. So YK, can you tell us a bit more about this blend finance? What kind of models that can be adopted and some examples of that, especially the public-private partnerships examples?
Yeah. So what I can talk about is, let's say, latest quite an emerging trend that is asset owners getting together, working with commercial asset managers, and then try to pursue all these kind of transition ambitions and objective. I think that is one emerging idea. Very luckily, my company is actually initiated one type of asset owner partnership. And I'm sure the HKMA with this big, let's say, big and deep experience, I think HKMA can initiate, such kind of a asset owner partnership in the future. So how it works is that, let's say, like-minded asset owners or asset allocators, they get together, come up with a good initiatives, and then that typically has the main goal of that project or initiative could be some just transition or energy transition or something transitional kind of financing, so that you need to have a very clear objective and goal, but at the same time, you need to have a lifelong, let's say, planning and measurement and oversight and governance of such initiative, and who would invite, et cetera, so that those kind of things that at HKMA can definitely do it. But I think one idea is one area to actually keep in mind is that, let's say, if you want to look at, let's say, project in deep detail, I think traditional idea is you only look at risk. So the risk assessment, what will be the risk for the future cash flow generation and et cetera. But then you need to actually actively look at the opportunity and what real world outcome and impact and changes you bring to the society. That should be really well measured before. But in order to do that, actually, you should have one script, well understood, let's say, project objective and et cetera. So that I think this is one area Hong Kong can do really well. And also it's you can have, depending on the return projection and et cetera, you can actually one can think about, let's say, okay, can it certain project be, let's say, concession financing, for example, so that you have to have a, let's say, open mind in terms of risk and return profile, have a very long term, because if this whole transition financing, it has to be very long term mindset, and then just do it. So I think that is something that Hong Kong can do really well. Yeah.
Thank you. I think having a clear project objective is very important, as you highlighted. On that note, I actually want to ask you, Ronald. Some of these transition finance, we understand, involving project that may not generate attractive return immediately, probably due to the nature of these long-term projects. So, what practical steps do you think we can take to engage all the stakeholders, such as government issuers, financial investors, to make transition finance more appealing and actually more impactful?
Well, thanks, King. If I know the full solution, I would be very rich, or much richer than I am right now. But I do think that I'm actually quite encouraged. So let me maybe unpack your question a little bit. I think you mentioned the long duration of some of these projects, but also in some situations the lack of or less competitiveness in terms of return for some of these projects. So I think, to me, there are three elements that really sometimes makes it difficult to make these projects successful. One, as you said, the time, the duration. The other is the return. And then I think the third element is the uncertainty of development of schedule. So let me respond in all three of these aspects. I'll use China as an example because I do think China's development is quite encouraging, and I think Hong Kong will be a direct beneficiary of it. When you look at China right now, what we see is that in terms of for some of the key industries, steel, aluminum, cement, we are seeing progress in the carbon trading market. These markets are expected to be soon added to the carbon trading, national carbon trading market. What that means is that it provides a price on some of these products. You can debate whether that price is high enough or not, or how aggressive that pricing should be. But what it does is that it brings closer or makes the return of some of these decarbonization products or sometimes even green products much more attractive. So let's use steel as an example, right? You come currently, in most cases, blast furnace, BOF, steel is the cheapest option. But if you have a carbon price, let's say, $100 in place, in that case, these blast furnace suddenly becomes the most expensive options. Instead, EAF steel by scrap, EAF steel with natural gas or green hydrogen would be a lot more competitive, if not the cheaper option. So I think having that price, on carbon is a huge development that I think will hugely improve the return profile of some of these projects or products. On the second issue of certainty of development, we've already mentioned some of the plans that China's outlined in terms of how to improve the energy and also the carbon intensity in some of the sectors. But one thing that I would like to point out is that in the upcoming 15 five-year plan, China already announced that they will start using absolute carbon emission targets as one of the indicators. So I think that again shows their commitment to have a serious reduction schedule. And obviously that spills into my third element too, which is have certainty in terms of the development. So we already know that China is planning to have a 2030 peaking and 2060 neutrality. But having more details as we see in some of these action plans in the 15 five-year plan, I think will give confidence to the market as well. And then the last point about the long duration of some of these things. There's no easy solution, but what you also see is that when you hear from some of the Chinese regulators, one keyword that they've repeatedly emphasized recently is patience capital. So these are insurance funds, these are sovereign funds, pension funds, that really, I think, would have a longer term investment horizon than some of the other investors you see. I do also think that the environmental profile of the industries, of the companies will be part of consideration. So in that sense, I do think that helps bridge the gap between having these needs for decarbonization and the capital to supply it. So overall, I think I'm really encouraged by where we're heading in China. And as a result, I think Hong Kong could be a huge beneficiary of these developments.
Thank you, Ronald. Actually, you've given me an opportunity to do a bit of marketing because we'll be publishing another paper in probably 2 weeks' time on carbon trading, how Hong Kong can connect the mainland CCER market with international trading. So, but yes, it's very encouraging to see to hear that China has taken a lot of active steps to help with the transition plan. But coming back to the real economy, after all, big companies have they have the resources. But what about small and medium-sized companies? There are a lot of barriers for them to implement the climate change plan. So, Ali, can you tell us, how you think the financial market can help them on this transition plan?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think small to mid-sized enterprises face a lot of barriers, right? It's not just access to climate or transition financing. A lot of times they see challenges in accessing financing in general. So if we're expecting them to do a lot of transition planning and sort of drive sustainability at a scale of large corporations, that may not be fair or feasible in the short term. So I think, to summarize the key barriers, they're seen by SMEs when it comes to transition finance, climate finance. I think the obvious one to point out would be policy uncertainty. As sustainability regulations, transition requirements are just taking shape, it might not be as simple to understand from an SME's perspective when they have survival to worry about. And again, when it comes to sustainability, investors tend to favor investees that have clearer, more robust, more comprehensive disclosure. And this is typically not something SMEs are able or have the capacity to put out on a regular basis. Because of this issue, there tends to be a gap between what SME can credibly do versus what investors or financiers could support SMEs to do. So I mentioned earlier to King's question about the development of regional and national taxonomies that include transition. These are all helpful developments. But in the first phase in recent years, we're seeing that taxonomies tend to support more established organizations or large corporations. So from an SME's perspective, there might need to be more hand-holding and more customized solutions to provide access to financing and to transfer the knowledge of sustainability and transition. And coming back to Hong Kong, we're seeing that HKMA has launched different initiatives, convening various banks are operating in Hong Kong to brainstorm and introduce measures that support SMEs. And there are specific measures dedicated to green financing. So as a result, different banks have launched, green financing partnership, green equipment loans, sustainability-linked financing by partnering with technical assurance organizations to kind of offload a little bit from the SMEs themselves in terms of demonstrating credibility or doing all the assurance and disclosure. So there's a bit more technical support on that end. But it seems like that there's more that could be done, right? There's always room for improvement in order to scale climate financing for SMEs. And the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross-Agency Steering Group has launched an SME climate questionnaire, which we think is an excellent initiative, and we do want to see more of such initiatives benefiting SMEs. Because what this questionnaire essentially does is to create different templates, separate templates for enterprises of various sizes, ranging from micro, small to mid ones, which is very much correlated with their ability and resources available to disclose in terms of sustainability and transition. So once an SME has filled out this questionnaire, the information could be shared among the stakeholders that are part of this cohort. So this takes a lot more pressure off of SMEs from the disclosure end, and there is a clear guidance of the metrics used to gauge what credible transition looks like. And in mainland China, we're also seeing some encouraging developments. So I think Gabe and Ron also talk a little bit about the provincial developments in China and the heavier industries. For example, in Hebei, which is a major steel producer in China, the provincial government has provided a clear template to help steel producers to basically measure and disclose their environmental metrics. So the result of that is clearly articulated in the template that it would provide, preferred lending, and it would allow different banks in the province or nationwide to support the steel industries to pursue their transition. So in short, I think, with riding on the taxonomy development, there needs to be more customized solutions and partnership to support SMEs to get access.
Thank you. That's very encouraging, Annie. Talking about SME, I want to ask Gabriel one more question before we open the floor to the audience for questioning. You mentioned technology earlier. So how can technology help companies, especially SMEs, to make the transition?
I think it's a really important point, because if we're looking at the transaction costs, data costs, reporting costs, all of this is an incremental burden that is required that a company needs to bear. What Ellie just highlighted is a really helpful example of how some templates and structures and government and policy support can help ease some of those burdens and facilitate reporting. Technology is also another critical enabler of reducing those transaction costs and reducing the burden. And so if we look at the potential for whether it's generative AI to help with the first draft of a report, or populating it from internal documents, or the idea of more structured, consolidated templates that can be reused for different participants in the industry, all of this goes a long way towards facilitating that data gathering, as well as reporting and classification issues. And if we go back to one of my earlier comments of looking at what's required for both investors and issuers, on an issuer side, all of these technology tools help facilitate that harmonization of frameworks, the alignment, the assessment that can be automated, that doesn't have to be done manually. So again, it can help reduce a lot of the burdens, as well as looking at collecting data from a supply chain or about an issuer or an instrument. For an investor side, what technology has the potential to facilitate is really scaling the classification and data collection process in order to make sure that there is a common and consistently used set of data, which then provides the ability for harmonization across different managers, across different jurisdictions. So again, it's looking at data tools to gather the information, to report it and articulate it more explicitly, and then the potential for government policy support to result in centralization or harmonization of some of those data sets as an industry or collaborative solution to help facilitate transparency and partnership. So I think that there's a really exciting role that technology can play in reducing burden for SMEs, but also for investors and facilitating harmonization.
Thank you, Gabriel, again for highlighting the importance of technology, especially when it comes to data. On this note, I would like to invite questions from the audience. Please post your questions online. Right, yeah, I have got a question here. So asking how we can actually untap these opportunities in transition finance for Hong Kong, and particularly with our global connectivity. Maybe I can ask YK to comment on that, please.
The connectivity.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I want to before going that, I want to highlight one very important thing. Transition financing is expensive. So what that means is that today's investment should be already green and then doesn't need to be transformed in the future. So that I think we should have a two-pronged approach, and today's investment, because the infrastructure and buildings and the lifeline is actually very long, right? So that in order to we have, let's say, infrastructure, buildings, and et cetera, build on non-green way, and then try to transition, I think that's really, really costly. So that we have to tackle today's problem with an urgency, but at the same time, when something needed to be transitioned, then we use transition financing. I think that is very important. Again, I think Hong Kong has a long history of a financial market, and I think HKMA has a very important role to play, connecting proactively with, let's say, international financing, asset owners, asset allocators. HKMA already has a very important impact on the commercial asset management side, so that we don't need to actually, and a lot of information is actually coming towards HKMA, but at the same time, what HKMA can do more is reaching out, let's say, far away from Asia Pacific, not just Asia Pacific, but also, let's say, Japan or China, and then bring China together, and then reaching out to, let's say, European countries, or let's say US even. So that already doing it, but then I think that more proactiveness can really help. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, marketing time again. Listen to our discussion in 2 weeks' time on that part on connectivity. Now, I've got another question. So are there any innovative financial instruments for climate change adoption measures? Is sustainability-linked bonds one of them? So please clarify. Maybe I can turn to Gabriel.
Sure. So sustainability-linked bonds have seen a volatile history in terms of the volume of issuance. So sustainability-linked bonds saw a massive rise in adoption, but then have seen a very significant drop in the last 12, 18 months. And part of the challenge here is around, without getting too technical, is setting the specific metrics, hurdles, and targets, and the extent to which they're actually meaningfully incremental for a business. So it goes back to a lot of the challenges of transition finance around how to think about the credibility of an instrument and how that can actually contribute to positive change, and whether it's meeting an investor's expectations and client preferences. So there's some challenges with SLBs within the market, and it has seen less issuance recently. I think that there has been a huge number of really innovative instruments that have been put into place. Blended finance is a fantastic example where there are a lot of examples of very specific issuance. Also, if we're looking at some of the work that the Nature Conservancy has done, and these are debt for nature swaps and other sorts of instruments, as well as using nature credits in order to help facilitate and make economic certain projects that otherwise wouldn't have been able to go ahead. These projects have really tangible, attributable positive outcomes and are a critical part of transition finance. So there's been a lot of innovation. The challenge we face is actually scaling the innovation to the level that we need it to address the size of the problem we face. And this is why within the recommendation paper, we're looking at those building blocks to try and focus on harmonization, standardization, capability building in order to set up Hong Kong in order to be able to facilitate that next leg of growth.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've got another question. This one is for Ellie. You mentioned real estate earlier. Can you expand a bit more on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very obvious one. In Hong Kong's Climate Action Plan 2050, there are some key decarbonization strategies outlined, including energy saving and buildings. And Hong Kong is known for its high building density, as seen in our beautiful backdrop here. And a lot of us already know that the building sector contributes to a majority of Hong Kong's carbon emission, energy consumption, and Carbon Action Plan 2050 also set a specific target for that. But the problem with Hong Kong's buildings is not that we have a lack of new certified green buildings. We've done a great job in that regard. But the existing building lots, specifically the ones that are owned by smaller companies, non-listed companies that may not have a very sophisticated sustainability programs, are contributing to majority of our carbon emissions in the city. So in the recently launched Hong Kong Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, the document already covers building and construction as a sector. But interestingly, the document also highlights a serious gap in building data, which are essentially about the majority of privately owned existing buildings that don't have energy data, because currently the government doesn't have a mandate for building owners to collect building data regularly or perform improvements following their energy audits, which happen every 10 years. From my understanding, in the real estate sector, there are discussions about revising the Hong Kong building energy code to basically make this mandatory energy audit more frequent, from every 10 years to every 5 years. However, the follow-up actions to improve building performance based on the audit findings is still going to be voluntary. So this is a great opportunity for Hong Kong to consider in terms of decarbonizing the built environment in general, but at the same time, it would bring financing benefits as well. Because when we see a lot of overseas markets, especially in Europe, individual markets already launched their minimum energy efficiency requirements, or sometimes they're called energy performance certificates. Without these EPCs, as a landlord, you simply cannot rent out a unit. So it's a very fundamental requirement, and it's in a way internalizing energy efficiency and sustainability improvement as part of the value of the asset that different stakeholders own. So by introducing a minimum energy efficiency requirement coupled with more frequent energy audits and follow-up actions, we do think there will be more opportunities for the Hong Kong real estate sector to transition. And compared to different sectors, real estate is very tangible. It's easier to find a common language as compared to other different sectors. When we look at energy efficiency, it might be more straightforward as compared to relying on various markets building certification or energy benchmarks, which come with various assumptions. So I think this is definitely something that policymakers in Hong Kong could think about prioritizing. And again, I think similar to what we shared earlier, there are a lot of opportunities when it comes to transitioning as well, and this also applies to the real estate sector. there are a lot of studies and discussions about how to effectively reduce indirect emissions, or so-called Scope 3 carbon emissions in the built environment sector. So this typically refers to construction emissions or emissions generated by tenants in commercial buildings. So in mainland China, there is great development around modular integrated construction, and this is something the Hong Kong government has been very proactively promoting as well. This would significantly reduce the emissions generated from the construction stage of the whole building life cycle. And on top of that, currently a lot of green buildings or buildings that are trying to decarbonize or retrofit for carbon reduction are looking for lower embodied carbon building materials that are compatible with local building codes, which has more to do with just environmental performance. It covers fire, safety, health, etc. So as a contractor or as a developer, oftentimes they'll have to import these materials from Western countries, which at the end of the day is not very low carbon and it's more costly. So there goes an opportunity for mainland China to share a lot more knowledge and these green products with Hong Kong, so we can work on cross-border collaboration. And ultimately, when it comes to transition finance, we talk a lot about data, right? And climate change doesn't respect jurisdictional boundaries. So when we think about flood risk, drought risk, typhoon risk, etc., there are many opportunities for GBA, Greater Bay Area cities, to share data about climate, to sort of to furnish a lot of the climate scenarios that we use to evaluate company level climate risk, and therefore give investors and financiers more confidence in supporting transition finance.
Thanks. There are quite a lot of questions still, but I know we're running out of time. So just one question, a quick one for Ronald. So you talked a lot about China. So how can Hong Kong facilitate the partnership across mainland China and broader APEC region? A quick comment?
Yeah, no, I'm literally just repeating what Gabriel said, but I think that the common taxonomy is hugely important to connect. I think the other thing that where Hong Kong may be able to take leadership role is just to define better how some of these hard-to-abate sectors are defined upstream. So let's use an example of steel, right? Like you have steel, but steel you have upstream, you have lime, you have iron pellets, you have all these precursor materials. Which of these, do you want to include, and which of these are not excluded? These goes beyond just plainly scope 1 and 2, 3, right? So there needs to be a lot more technical work, and I think if Hong Kong can take a leadership role in defining it and aligning themselves with some of the international standards, I think that would really help.
Yeah, thanks. I'll answer a couple of questions quickly. Yes, there will be a recording of today's webinar. So it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel. And another opportunity for me to market our upcoming paper again, because this question asking about how linkage on carbon trading can be done. It is on 11th of December, the next webinar. On that note, I want to thank our panelists for their really insightful sharing, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar. But please stay behind for a quick polling question. Sorry, thank you.